On the 28th of February of 2026, Israeli and American fighter jets crossed the Middle Eastern airspace in attack formation. The targets were Iranian military installations, command centers, strategic infrastructure built over decades of investment and secrecy. What happened in the hours that followed reshaped global geopolitics in a way that no analyst, no matter how seasoned, had calculated with full precision. Iran did not retreat. Iran closed the sea. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps activated its naval forces and blocked the Strait of Hormuz, a corridor of water only 56 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, squeezed between Iran to the north and Oman to the south, a place most people have never visited, will never visit, and yet directly controls the price of fuel at the corner gas station, the cost of shipping any manufactured product across any ocean, and the economic balance of nations that have nothing to do with this war. 1/5 of all the oil traded on the planet passes through that strip of water. When it closed, the world felt it within hours. Tankers anchored mid-sea, refusing to advance. Insurance companies suspended maritime coverage for the entire Persian Gulf region overnight. Commodity markets opened the next morning and immediately began bleeding. The price of crude oil jumped with a violence not seen since the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Shipping companies rerouted their fleets around the Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks to delivery schedules and hundreds of thousands of dollars to each voyage. Grocery chains in Europe began quietly calculating contingency plans for supply disruptions. But this was not simply a naval maneuver. This was a message written in the language that the world understands most clearly: economic pain. Iran had learned from decades of sanctions, from watching its own economy suffocate under American financial pressure, that the most powerful weapon available to a nation under siege is the ability to make that siege hurt everyone else too. If Iran was going to suffer, the entire global economy was going to feel the pressure. That was the doctrine. That was the calculation. Washington reacted with controlled fury. The Pentagon repositioned 2 carrier strike groups already operating in the region. Diplomatic cables flew between capitals. The United Nations Security Council convened an emergency session that produced, as emergency sessions at the United Nations typically produce, a strongly worded statement and absolutely no resolution. Britain issued navigation warnings through the United Kingdom maritime trade operations. Japan, which imports more than 80% of its oil from the Persian Gulf, sent emergency delegations to both Washington and Riyadh within 48 hours. And in the middle of all this, on the 7th of April, something unexpected happened. The two sides talked, not through back channels or intermediaries whispering in hotel corridors. They actually talked formally, with documents on the table. Iran confirmed a partial agreement and signaled a temporary reopening of the strait for 2 weeks. Trump declared that nearly all points of disagreement had been resolved. Iranian and American delegations accepted each other's frameworks as a basis for dialogue. The world exhaled briefly, and oil prices dropped. It seemed, for exactly 1 week, like adults had entered the room. They had not. Islamabad, Pakistan, the 11th of April, 2026. A city that has spent decades navigating between the gravitational pulls of rival powers, now hosting the most consequential negotiation of the young century. American and Iranian delegations sat across from each other in a building surrounded by Pakistani security forces, cameras from every major news network positioned outside the gates, and the entire global economy watching in real time. The talks lasted 21 hours. 21 hours of arguments, proposals, counter-proposals, revised documents, translated statements, diplomatic formalities, and ultimately complete collapse. Not a partial failure, not a temporary recess. A full breakdown traced back to a single issue that both sides knew from the beginning would be the wall they could not climb over: the Iranian nuclear program. The Americans arrived with a clear demand: any peace agreement, any reopening of Hormuz, any lifting of the naval blockade that Trump was already threatening publicly had to include a verified, monitored, and permanent halt to uranium enrichment on Iranian soil. The Iranians arrived with an equally clear position. The nuclear program was a matter of national sovereignty, non-negotiable, not subject to foreign diktat, and would not appear on any peace agreement under any circumstances. Everything else was discussable. That was not. Vice President J.D. Vance left the building after the final session without stopping for questions. His statement was delivered through a spokesman and contained exactly one sentence that mattered. The Iranians, he said, had chosen not to accept American terms. Back in Washington, Trump was already drafting his next move on social media. The language he used was not diplomatic. It was not measured. It was the language of a man who had offered a deal, been refused, and was now explaining what came next in terms that required no translation. He was going to close Hormuz himself. On the morning of the 13th of April, the United States Central Command activated the naval blockade. 17 warships repositioned. Destroyers, cruisers, and assets from 2 carrier strike groups formed a line across the entrance to the strait on the Gulf of Oman side. The operational directive was unambiguous. Any vessel departing from or heading to an Iranian port would be intercepted, redirected, and if necessary, disabled. Any Iranian military vessel that approached the blockade line would be, in the exact words transmitted publicly by the Commander-in-Chief, immediately eliminated. The United Kingdom Maritime Trade Operations Agency sent out an emergency bulletin to every commercial vessel in the region. Lloyd's of London suspended new underwriting for any ship planning to transit within 200 nautical miles of the Iranian coast. Within the first 6 hours of the blockade, 6 Iranian-linked vessels turned around mid-route and returned to port. By the end of the first day, not a single ship had broken through. The blockade held with a completeness that surprised even the officers running it. Iran's response came within hours. The Iranian military issued a formal statement calling the blockade an act of piracy under international maritime law. The foreign ministry summoned ambassadors. The commander of the Revolutionary Guard Navy appeared on state television and delivered a warning that would be repeated on news channels across the planet for the next 72 hours. Security in the Persian Gulf and the Sea of Oman, he said, is either for everyone or for no one. No port in the region would be safe if Iranian ports remained under siege. The words were not empty. Within days, Iran began backing them up. The 21st of April arrived with news that the ceasefire, such as it was, had begun cracking at the edges. Trump had briefly paused offensive operations, waiting for Iran to deliver a unified counter-proposal. The Revolutionary Guard interpreted the pause differently. While American attention was momentarily divided between the Gulf and a separate diplomatic conversation happening through Omani intermediaries, Iranian naval forces made their move. 2 commercial vessels were seized. The Guard's naval units intercepted them in the strait, boarded them with armed personnel, and escorted them at gunpoint to Iranian coastal waters. The seizures were filmed by drone footage that Iranian state media broadcast within hours. The message was deliberate and layered. Iran was demonstrating that it still controlled access within the strait regardless of the American blockade at its entrance. It was demonstrating that commercial shipping remained vulnerable. And it was demonstrating, above all, that the Revolutionary Guard operated on its own timeline, not on the schedule of diplomats in Islamabad or Washington. The American response was immediate and precise. The Pentagon confirmed that a naval destroyer had intercepted and boarded an oil tanker carrying Iranian petroleum in the Indian Ocean. It was the second such interdiction in 3 days. The cargo was documented, photographed, and the vessel was redirected. By the 23rd of April, United States Central Command announced publicly that 33 vessels had been turned away or redirected since the beginning of the blockade. The number was not just a statistic, it was a demonstration of operational control, published deliberately, timed to coincide with Iranian statements claiming American forces were losing their grip on the situation. Meanwhile, 2,000 ships sat waiting, anchored in the Gulf of Oman, in the Arabian Sea, scattered across holding patterns that stretched for hundreds of kilometers. Tankers from Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, container ships bound for Asia and Europe, liquefied natural gas carriers from Qatar, the largest exporter in the world, unable to fulfill contracts that had been signed years in advance. Japan's government began rationing industrial energy consumption. South Korea convened emergency sessions with its largest manufacturing corporations. India quietly accelerated conversations with Russia about alternative supply routes. The BBC published an analysis calculating that every additional week of closure cost the global economy somewhere between $4 and $6 billion in direct logistics costs alone, not counting the downstream effects on manufacturing, agriculture, and consumer prices. The number was almost too large to process, and yet the strait remained closed day after day because neither side had yet reached the threshold of pain that would force a genuine compromise. Then came the 18th of April, a moment that stripped away whatever remained of the diplomatic veneer. Iranian forces fired on 2 oil tankers attempting to navigate through the northern section of the strait. Both ships were hit. Neither sank. The crews sent distress signals that were picked up by the United States Navy within minutes. American helicopters were on scene before Iranian patrol boats could complete their operation. The tankers were escorted out of the combat zone, their hulls damaged, their crews shaken but alive. Iran closed Hormuz completely that same day. No exceptions. No humanitarian corridors. No passage for any vessel of any nationality under any circumstances. May the 4th of 2026 was not chosen for symbolic reasons. There was nothing cinematic about the timing. The decision to send American destroyers through the strait was driven by operational calculations, by the accumulating pressure of 2,000 vessels waiting in holding patterns, by the phone calls arriving at the White House from allied governments warning that their economies could not sustain another 2 weeks of this, and by a single intelligence assessment delivered to the Secretary of Defense the previous evening, suggesting that Iran was preparing to mine additional sections of the northern channel. The operation began before dawn. 2 destroyers entered the strait from the Gulf of Oman's side, their radar systems active, their defensive countermeasures fully deployed, their crews at battle stations. They were escorting 2 American commercial cargo vessels, chosen specifically because their contents, industrial equipment bound for a civilian infrastructure project, had no military application. The legal framing was deliberate. This was not a military invasion of Iranian waters. This was freedom of navigation, the foundational principle of international maritime law, being exercised with warships as escorts. Iran's Revolutionary Guard launched its response within minutes of detecting the formation. Small, fast attack boats, the same vessels that had been the Guard's signature tool for 3 decades of asymmetric naval doctrine in the Gulf, moved to intercept. Cruise missiles were fired from coastal batteries on the Iranian shore. Drones launched from positions further inland. It was a coordinated multi-vector attack executed with speed and aggression that indicated extensive prior preparation. The American response was devastating in its efficiency. The destroyers' close-in weapon systems engaged the incoming drones and missiles. Electronic warfare assets suppressed targeting radar on the Iranian shore batteries. The fast attack boats were engaged directly. 7 Iranian vessels were destroyed in the engagements that followed. The Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, appeared before cameras that afternoon and described the operation as peaceful, an almost surreal choice of word given what had just occurred, but legally precise in its framing. He also promised, with zero ambiguity, what he called overwhelming firepower in response to any further attack on escorted vessels. The cargo ships completed their transit. The destroyers returned to their formation. The strait had been crossed, but Iran published its own version of events within hours. State media broadcast footage of what was described as Iranian naval forces repelling an American incursion. The Revolutionary Guard claimed to have prevented the warships from entering Hormuz entirely. 2 different realities transmitted simultaneously to 2 different audiences, each supported by footage that was genuine but framed in ways that made the same sequence of events tell completely opposite stories. The world watching from outside had no clean way to determine which narrative was accurate. That confusion was itself a weapon, deployed by both sides with full intentionality. And somewhere in the middle of all this, with smoke still rising from the water, diplomats were already making phone calls. There is a document, 1 page long, that may or may not determine whether this conflict escalates into something from which the region cannot recover for a generation. It was drafted in Washington, reviewed by the National Security Council, cleared by the Secretary of State, and transmitted through Pakistani intermediaries to Tehran sometime in the first days of May 2026. 1 page. The Americans deliberately kept it short. A long document could be dissected, amended, delayed. A single page demanded a yes or a no. The terms, as reported by multiple sources with access to diplomatic communications, are direct. A mutual suspension of all offensive naval operations in and around the Strait of Hormuz. An immediate reopening of the waterway to commercial traffic of all nationalities. A framework agreement committing both sides to formal nuclear negotiations within 30 days of signing. And a mutual public acknowledgement that neither side seeks the total destruction of the other, a sentence that sounds almost absurdly basic until you consider that neither government had said it clearly in months. Trump suspended the convoy escort operation while awaiting Tehran's response. The decision was framed publicly as a gesture of good faith. Privately, according to sources cited by the Reuters news agency, it reflected a genuine calculation that the window for a negotiated exit was narrow and closing. The American economy, insulated by domestic energy production from the worst effects of the closure, was nevertheless feeling pressure from its allies. The European Union had sent 3 separate communications in a single week. Japan's prime minister had made a personal call. South Korea was publicly discussing emergency measures. The cost of being right was beginning to approach the cost of being pragmatic. From Islamabad, Pakistan's chief negotiator delivered a statement that traveled around the world in minutes. "We are going to conclude this very soon," he said. "We are almost there." The words were careful, calibrated, the kind of language that experienced mediators use when they believe something is genuinely within reach but do not want to collapse it with premature certainty. Iran's response, when it came, carried its own layers of meaning. Tehran declared publicly that it wanted a comprehensive agreement with the United States, not a temporary ceasefire. Not a technical arrangement about maritime corridors. A comprehensive agreement. The word choice was noted immediately by analysts on every continent. Comprehensive, in the diplomatic vocabulary of this conflict, means including the nuclear file. It means Iran was signaling, for the first time with any real clarity, that it was prepared to discuss the one subject it had refused to put on the table in Islamabad. 2,000 ships still waited in the waters outside the strait. Crews that had been anchored for weeks. Fuel running low on some vessels. Perishable cargo lost on others. Contracts defaulted. Insurance claims filed. Letters of credit suspended. The human and financial cost of every additional day was accumulating in spreadsheets and shipping companies, in emergency budget revisions at finance ministries, in the lived experience of people who had no idea that a 56-kilometer channel of water in a part of the world they had never thought about was quietly restructuring the terms of their daily lives. The 48-hour window for Iran's formal response to the American memo was closing. The outcome was unknown. The stakes had not been this concentrated in a single diplomatic moment since the Cold War, and the world, whether it understood the geography or not, whether it could find Hormuz on a map or not, was waiting. Because whatever happened next in those narrow waters between Iran and Oman was not going to stay there. It never does.